Independence. The day we pointed western, the morning the Reed family left Independence, Missouri, the town smelled like wet wood and coffee and animal sweat. A ring of wagons creaked in the field outside the last row of clapboard storefronts, canvas bellying in the wind like the lungs of something living, something about to crawl west. Elias Reed ran a hand across the wagon's tongue, feeling the clean bite of the fresh-honed pin. He had planed that wood himself, the way he used 2 plain cabinet doors back in Illinois. Cabinets were behind him now. In front of him, 2,000 miles of rumor. Double quotes Ruth, "Don't feed the oxen from your palm," Nora said. But their 9-year-old was already giggling, delighted by the sandpaper tongue testing her fingers for molasses. Jonah, 14 and suddenly wider at the shoulders than the winter before, checked the lashings again. Flour, bacon, dried apples, coffee, beans, the Dutch oven. The rifle wrapped against damp, the Bible wrapped against soot, and the small velvet pouch with the wedding ring Elias's mother had taken off in her bed, looking at him with clear eyes, and saying, "Take Nora west, if she asks it." She had asked. So here they were, standing at the edge of the known. The company had elected a captain 2 nights earlier, Patrick O'Rourke, a teamster with trail miles behind him and a voice that could slice through fog. He'd posted a sheet of rules on the side of his own wagon. Wake, 4 a.m., cattle gathered by 5, breakfast by 6, roll at 7 sharp. The fine for dawdling was measured in the captain's glare and the company's patience, both in short supply when grass and weather were a clock you couldn't wind back. "Mr. Reed," called a voice, "you said you're a carpenter." "I'm Josiah Bellsmith by trade. If you see a wheel start to wobble, sing out." The man who stepped around the wagon had forearms like iron staves and a scar along his jaw he didn't seem to remember acquiring. He grinned so easily it felt like light. At his side walked Hester Pike, a widow with a midwife's hands and a feed sack apron with pockets that seemed to produce exactly what anyone needed, whenever they needed it. "I catch babies," she'd said the night they met around O'Rourke's fire, "and sometimes falling men." Elias liked the way this company had been stitched, a seam of blacksmith and midwife, a thread of schoolteacher, Miss Sally Evans, who was 20 but somehow older, a cord of veterans and farmers, and more. Children then seemed safe to trust to prairie wind. It was a community built out of strangers and a wager. "Mount up." O'Rourke's call was a crack of sound that made even the nervous horses lift their heads. Oxen put their weight into the yokes, leather creaked. Wheels bit dirt. They rolled in. The first mile, the world didn't change. Fences dwindled. The architecture of the east blurred to pasture and skirted creeks. Nora walked beside the rear wheel, skirt kilted with pins, boots already taking the wagon rut's signature chew. "You're not riding, Ma?" Ruth asked. "Wagons are for babies and broken bones," Nora said, and Ruth loved the answer so much she repeated it under her breath like a charm. Jonah walked up front with Elias's stick in his hand for the occasional oxpasosian, and every few minutes his eyes flicked to the horizon, like there might be mountains hiding just beyond the next oatgrass ripple. By noon they learned the first lesson of westering dust is a food group. It hazed the air, it salted the bacon, it packed in ears, and somehow still left a thirst no cup could chase. They stopped for an hour in a bottom where cottonwoods shivered their coins of shade, and the creek ran shallow and purling. Everybody refilled barrels, and Hester Pike made the children stand back, upstream for filling, downstream for washing, she said, loud enough for half the train to hear. And latrine, farther still. Cholera don't care that you're tired. She had made the words sound like a hinge that had swung on too many doors. They boiled water. Coffee took on a bitter, boiled temps that would become the flavor of the entire summer. Ruth watched the steam and asked with perfect curiosity, "Is Oregon coffee sweet?" "If it is," Jonah said, "I'll drink 2 cups a day." "3, and you'll start walking sideways," Elias said. And he made a face so solemn that Ruth laughed and spilled a little. Laughter, he realized, was a currency he'd be called on to make when supplies ran low. Afternoon brought there, first crossing the Blue River, its bottom a lace of slick rocks, banked with mud that had ambitions toward shoe leather. O'Rourke sent her riders across to test the depth, then set a ferry of ropes and men. Wheels chained, cattle steady, Josiah Bell called, "Don't you look down, you ain't going there." The reeds waited their turn, watching a wagon ahead of them tilt, correct, slide, recover until finally O'Rourke gave Elias the nod. "Easy, boy," Elias murmured to the near ox, and felt the old woodshop cadence come back to his voice. "Easy. Do the work in front of you. Don't borrow trouble from the far shelf." Halfway across, Ruth squealed. The river had stolen her. "Shoo." Jonah lunged, missed, and then a handful of children were shouting, and Ruth was barefoot on the rocks, and the shoe was skimming away like a fish that had learned to be leather. A girl from the Bradley wagon ran downstream and snagged it with a stick. When she handed it back to Ruth, she said, "I'm Liddy," as if she were giving Ruth a present and a name. "Thank you," Ruth said, awed. Names given in a river had a weight you could feel on your tongue. They made it up the far bank with only a few scrapes, and Elias looked back at the crossing with the private pride a man felt when nothing had failed yet. He knew enough to harvest that feeling while it was ripe. That night they circled the wagons, not for arrows, but for anamosa, corral of canvas, and spoke. The evening wind slid under the wagon covers and licked the cook fires sideways. Hester. Pike passed a jar of pennyroyal grease that smelled like an argument with a garden and promised to keep mosquitoes disinterested. Miss Evans wrote by the fire, head bent, the page a bright flag in the dusk. Captain O'Rourke walked the circle with a tin cup of black coffee that looked like a liquid oath. "Read," he said when he came to their fire. "You laid your wheels true. If you can spare a morning, I'd have you check the Peterson hub. They've got a wobbly'll turn to splinters." "I'll look," Elias said, and he saw the look Nora cut him. This was how communities were made, one borrowed morning at a time. After supper salt pork, beans that remembered water, a biscuit that tried to be bread. The men met around O'Rourke's fire. Trails are made of stories as much as ruts, and stories bring maps to life. A mountain man with a beard like braided bark told them about a bluff that looked like a chimney, a rock that looked like a courthouse, a river that braided and unbraided itself all summer long. He said, "There's a cut-off up beyond Fort Bridger. Promises to shave days. Bears the name Hastings. Some call it a shortcut. Me. I've learned not to take a knife to a mile just because it says it can." Noted O'Rourke said. He had the air of a man who would obey his own judgment even if the word shortcut showed up with a choir. Ruth fell asleep against Nora's thigh. Jonah pretended not to be tired, and then slept like someone had turned him off. Elias lay down under the wagon, as men did when they wanted to be the first thing a storm had to argue with. He looked up at the spokes etched like ribs against starlight. Wheels, he thought. How small a thing to trust with a life. a hoop of wood, a band of iron, a wedge of grease. And still tomorrow they would carry his children across the skin of the world from the darkness. Josiah Bell's voice drifted. Hear that? Coyotes. Means they're small game. Means the prairie don't hate us yet. What's it sound like when it does? Someone asked. Josiah laughed like he'd been asked a riddle. Quieter, he said. Elias folded his hands under his head and tried to hold the sound of his family breathing. He took inventory the way a man counting coins in bad times, my truths. Light snore, Jonah's long exhale, Nora humming a hymn under her breath, like a thread through cloth. He had said yes to this because of the look in Nora's eyes, and because he wanted a piece of ground where his son's children could plant a tree and know why they did it. He could feel the bargain in his bones, and in the prairie wind that made the canvas talk, and in the knowledge that somewhere ahead there were graves with markers and graves with none. Morning would come at 4. It always did, between now and then. He slept in fits and starts, like a man in a house whose walls were moving. Asterisk graves along the Platte by the time the company found the Platte River. Their boots had the same color as the road. A mile wide and 6 inches deep, O'Rourke said, squinting at the gray-green sprawl. The Platte ran like a loose shoelace across the prairie braids and shallows and sandbars that would shiver under a man's weight. It was a lifeline and a trap, a place for water, barrels, and fever both. They learned the river's manners quickly. Men fetched buckets, women set kettles. Children, sternly, were made to stand back and learn how to wait. Hester Pike enforced the sanitation line like it was a law from the mountain. Up there for drinking, down there for washing, far yonder for burying, she said, pointing with a ladle, asterisk. Burying, Ruth asked. Waste, child, Hester said gently. And sometimes we bury other things. The first grave came 2 days later. It was a boy from the Bradley wagon knot, Liddy's brother, mercifully, but her cousin Thomas, a sweet-faced 8-year-old who had been running at the edges of the company, chasing meadowlarks. He began to complain of cramps in the night. By morning, water poured through him. By mid-afternoon, Hester's face had taken on a look Elias would come to know like whether the look she wore when skill wasn't going to save anyone. We need boiled water, she said. They had it salt, she said. They had that too. She mixed what she called a tonic and spooned it into the boy's mouth. He coughed and cried and apologized for the crying. His mother stroked his hair until the strokes slowed and then stopped. The prairie wind went on making its steady music through the grass. Elias dug with Josiah and O'Rourke and a farmer named Peterson whose hub did need fixing. Sod is work. It lifts like a mat, like a sheet of the world asking to be folded and set aside. They dug until the shovel struck a vein of earth that smelled like rain when there wasn't any. Hester spoke psalm words over the boy, and his mother pressed the tip of a knife to mark the wood of a cross that wouldn't last a winter dot. Ruth held Nora's hand until her fingers went white. Jonah, who had been trying on manhood since independence, set his teeth in his lip, and followed Elias back to the shovels without being asked. Afterward, nobody spoke for a while, and then everyone spoke at once. Because sorrow needs fact and argument to keep it from swallowing whole. We boil everything, Hester said again, and you could hear in the repetition the truth that you said what you could do when there were things you see. OULDN, single quotes, T. By noon the next day. The train had found a groove roll, rest, roll. The prairie made a cathedral of sky over them. Swales of buffalo grass went gold in the sun like someone was passing a match behind it. Sometimes, if you watched the horizon long enough, you swore it moved. You swore a stand of trees took a step at a noon. Halt. A small group of auto riders approached slowly with a calm that read as respect. O'Rourke and Josiah rode out with open hands. Hester stood between wagons with her apron on, which meant peace, which meant hospitality if terms were clean. The auto chief wore a breastplate of bone that clicked softly like a quiet language. He pointed at Josiah's coffee with his chin a question. Trade. Josiah said, and the chief's mouth made the shape of a smile. Coffee and sugar went one way. Dried bison meat and 3 pairs of moccasins came the other. The moccasins turned out to be a miracle medicine for blistered feet. Ruth tried on hers and said, they feel like clouds. And the auto woman she'd traded with nodded at Ruth's delight the way mothers do in any language. You see, Nora whispered to Ruth as the riders left. People are people. Remember who told you that? Ruth nodded, brow furrowed in the way that meant she'd filed it under permanent that evening. Miss Evans taught the children words from her schoolhouse in Illinois. Discipline, endurance, community. Ruth copied them into the margin of a paper that had once been the back of a shop bill. Jonah, who liked to pretend he wasn't listening, mouthed the letters while whittling. Elias mended the Peterson hub, hand on spoke, ear to the creak that told him where the complaint lived. Wood is a conversation. It tells you how it wants to break, if you don't hear how it wants to bend. The night brought a thunderhead that sacked the horizon and then climbed on top of it. Lightning unstitched the sky. The wind came shoulder first, trying to roll wagons that had no wish to go. O'Rourke blew 3 short notes on a whistle that meant get tight, and the circle shrank until it felt, for a minute, like they were all breathing out of the same lung. A strike hit a cottonwood at the edge of camp and split it like a rule book. The flash was an entire afternoon of light crushed into a single heartbeat. Keep the canvas wet, Hester barked. Buckets. Josiah had them stacked and passing in less time than it took to say his name. When the worst of the wind passed, the rain stayed, and when the rain passed, quiet came down so fast the ears rang with it. Count heads, O'Rourke said into the hush. They did, everyone answered. Relief tastes like bread. They ate theirs in silence. Morning was born into mud. The edges of the Platte had crawled toward the wagons as if the river had been listening the night before and wanted to be included. They waited an extra hour for the ground to remember how to be ground. Captain, Elias said, your left rear chain has wear. He had slept little and listened much. O'Rourke glanced, saw, nodded. Respect is simply noticing in the right direction. They rolled again through a world rinsed clean. The smell of sage rose under the wheels. The children found bones whitening in the sun buffalo mostly, but sometimes a horse, the story of a bad day written in teeth and nothing else. Ruth picked up a jawbone with tiny teeth like a doll's and asked Nora, do you think this one was loved? All the way to the end, Nora said, and Ruth set the bone back down with a care that made Elias love his wife more than he had the night before. Around a bend in the river, they came upon a stretch of sand where the wind had made a book. Pages were the wagon ruts of other companies, layered and crossing, a palimpsest of iron and hope. A bit of board stuck up from the sand with letters burned in, Jane, July, no year, and nothing else. Hester stopped, hat in her hands. "We say the names," she said. "Then we go on." So they said it Janand. They did. At Fort Kearny, they saw the price of hunger. Coffee was dear. Sugar was a story you heard about. Flour bought with 3 needles and an iron hinge felt like theft in reverse. A clerk with a nice pen told them there was a faster way if they wanted it the cut-off the mountain man had named with a wince. Men with less patience than sense love it, the clerk said with the cheerfulness of a man who would be sleeping indoors either way. "We'll keep the river," O'Rourke said, and that was that. On a long afternoon when the heat put a hand on every man's shoulder and pressed, a boy from the Wilson wagon wandered beyond the circle chasing the flicker of a prairie chicken. The boy didn't come back. O'Rourke sent riders. The prairie laughed without sound. Nora took Ruth's hand so tightly. Ruth made a small sound and didn't complain about it. It was Hester who found the boy, half a mile off, standing still as a fence post, eyes wide, mouth full of the terrible astonishment of being lost. She walked up to him like a mare comes up to a skittish foal, palms open, voice low. "There you are," she said, as if he had kept an appointment. "I was afraid I'd beat you here." The boy took her hand as if he'd remembered he owned one. That night, Hester told the parents, tie a red strip to his belt. Teach him to stop when he can't see camp. Teach him to yell his name like it's a bell. Miss Evans turned it into a lesson for all the children the next morning. Jonah pretended not to listen and then quietly cut a red strip for Ruth's belt. Sometimes the prairie gave gifts to pronghorn meat that Josiah and O'Rourke shared around the circle. A clutch of eggs found in a hollow, a breeze that made the candles hold still long enough to read. Miss Evans read from a newspaper 3 months old, and Elias felt the world behind them shrank to a thumb-sized map. They reached a ford where the Platte narrowed to a bully. O'Rourke chose the rope ferry again. Midway across, the near ox put a hoof in a hole and went to its knees, dragging the wagon sideways. Jonah was on the rope without thinking. Elias felt his own feet moving faster than his thoughts and heard his voice in a tone he'd used with timber that wanted to split. "Ho, they're easy." The ox shuddered, found bottom, pushed up, and the wagon straightened. The company breathed out in a rush so loud it was almost song. "Luck," Josiah said. "Practice," Elias replied. And they touched palms once, like men who understood both. Things could be true at the same time. That evening, they made camp near a stand of cottonwood, tall enough to print a new skyline. Hester walked the circle and then stopped, her head turned. "You hear that?" she asked Nora. "What? Cough?" Hester said. 2 wagons down. Her face had that weather look again. Nora didn't say the word. She didn't have to. They ate in quiet. Ruth fell asleep with moccasins on her feet and a red strip on her belt. Jonah sat by the fire long after the sparks had turned to stars, whittling a little man with a hat and a long rifle. He set the figure on the wagon wheel and said, "Stand watch," and it did. The cough came again, on a wind that seemed, suddenly, to have learned a new song. Asterisk. Fort Laramie and the fever bargain fort. Laramie rose out of cottonwoods and rumor like a promise that somebody, somewhere, had put up walls against the wind. The parade ground was a corrugated quilt of wagon ruts and hoof cuts, and the flag cracked. In a sky so bright it looked like iron gone to white dot as the company rolled in. A bugle lifted a note that made Ruth straighten her back as if music were a command. Soldiers in faded blue watched with interest that carried more weariness than threat. Traders took the measure of each wagon with eyes trained to convert canvas to coin. A doctor leaned in the doorway of a clapboard room, arms crossed, a pinch of snuff tucked in his cheek. Elias did inventory with his tongue, the taste of dust and coffee and worry. They had come just in time for news. A freighter with mules like argumentative bishops said the Blue Mountains had seen snow already. Early, he said, like the word might be talked out of its decision. A French trapper told a story about a pass poured full of drifts like bread dough and gestured with hands that had weathered into rawhide. O'Rourke listened with his chin in his hand. "We push," he said finally, "but we push smart." Smart meant a tighter schedule, fewer fires at night, and a list of repairs that began to feel like a sermon. Elias mended a cracked rim, set a new pin in a doubletree, reset a shoe. On a reluctant mule with Josiah's help careful, Josiah said, "That one holds grudges." He felt his work in his shoulders, but he also felt the strange relief of competence. Wood and iron responded to his hands. Even if weather did not dot near sundown on the second day, Nora shivered. At first, Elias thought she needed a shawl. Then, he saw her lips had the wrong color, and her hand shook as she poured coffee. And she set the pot down like she'd forgotten how to put things on the earth. Hester touched Nora's forehead and went very still. "Ague," Hester said. "Marsh fever." She didn't say malaria. She didn't need the extra syllables. The Platte had buzzed with mosquitoes like a song you can't not hum, and now the song wanted a verse. They carried Nora to the surgeon in the clapboard room. He was younger than Elias had expected, and older in the eyes. He listened, looked, poked lightly, and nodded. "Quinine," he said, like a man pulling a key from a pocket. "Twice a day, bitter as divorce." He named a price that made Elias feel the weight of every coin in the velvet pouch and of the ring he had no intention of trading. "You'll boil water," the doctor said. "You'll keep her warm. She'll hate the taste. Make her drink anyway." Ruth cried once, a small, hot sound that shamed her. Jonah walked outside and kicked a cottonwood root and then stood with his forehead against the bark, as if trees could lend out their patience. Elias paid. The powder looked like nothing, the trail's cruelest trick. He stirred it into water and watched Nora's face as she swallowed. She made a joke about sucking on a tree that had learned to be medicine. It wasn't a good joke, but Elias loved it for trying. Fort Laramie put on a small dance that night. The fiddle had been tuned more times than it had been played, but it had learned to be social anyway. Miss Evans danced with a soldier who had polished his boots with nothing but his pride. Ruth slept in Hester's lap. Jonah sat statue still on the wagon tongue while Elias built the night fire with too much care. Nora slept and woke and slept. Fever is a tide. It takes and gives and makes no promises about which it will be tomorrow. Elias learned a new schedule medicine. At dawn and dusk, small sips at noon, a joke in between, a hymn when her breath caught. A story about Illinois when her eyes went far away. He said the names of familiar trees, oak, maple, hickory, the beach by the creek where they had once tied a swing in a year, when money had come easy and the house had felt too small in a way you can love. On the third day, Nora's fever broke. Briefly, she ate 3 spoonfuls of corn mush with the triumph of a general. "Do I look like death?" she asked. "You look like someone death is tired of arguing with," Elias said, and Hester snorted a laugh that sounded like relief, scuffed. On a boot heel, Fort Laramie also offered the first true test of the company's will. Some families had had enough of rumor made real. The Wilsons decided to winter there, to work for the army, to put off mountains until their courage remembered how to walk. Hester put a hand on Mrs. Wilson's shoulder a long time and then took it away like a blessing. Miss Evans cried, a quiet cry for the children she had been teaching to spell the West. O'Rourke counted the heads that would keep going and didn't let his face show the sum. "Read?" he asked Elias. Elias looked at Nora, who looked at the horizon with a hunger that had no interest in walls. "We go on," she said, with a rasp that still sounded like a bell. "We go on," Elias echoed, as if the echo could make a vow into a road. They left Fort Laramie at dawn, the company smaller and more tightly knit. Joseph, a Shoshone young man who had been trading at the fort, rode up as they filed onto the trail. His English was easy, his eyes were older than his face. "Snow comes early," he said, matter of fact as weather. "I know a way to the pass. Faster, not easy, but true." He looked at O'Rourke like men look at men whose judgment will touch their own lives. O'Rourke nodded once. "Walk with us," he said. And just like that, the company had a new map made out of a person. The land rose in ways your breath could feel before your feet did. The plains gave up a little of their reach. Rocks began to practice for mountains. Chimney Rock showed itself in the distance, like a finger pointing at its own joke. Jonah whooped when he saw it and then pretended he hadn't. Ruth asked if the chimney meant they were almost home. "It means we are halfway to halfway," Nora said. And Ruth made peace with that because children are better at halves. Fever came back to Nora that night, a smaller tide. The quinine did its sharp work. Elias learned to read his wife's face by lamp smoke and to count the beats of her pulse with a thumb pressed to her wrist. Jonah brought water without being asked. Ruth drew a picture of Oregon on the back of the page that had the words endurance and community on it. Her Oregon had apple trees and a house with 2 rooms and a roof that rain loved. They ate pronghorn that Josiah and O'Rourke brought down at dusk, and the meat made everyone remember being animals in a good way, muscles working, blood doing what it learned to do before there were jobs and clocks. Miss Evans told a story about a Roman road that ran straight because the builders believed the shortest path honored the gods. O'Rourke laughed softly. "Gods don't have mud," he said. At Scott's Bluff, wind came like a sermon again. The company hunkered down under the slope where pine and stone made friends against weather. Joseph showed Elias how to read a ridgeline for the way snow taught it to be dangerous. "Corners," Joseph said, pointing. "Looks like a cloud. Falls like a hammer." Elias, who had thought he knew wood, began to understand how much he didn't know about stone. They mended wheel brakes with rawhide. They walked the hardest pitches because asking animals to haul flesh and oak both was a sin Hester would name out loud. Nora rode for an hour when the fever wave took her knees. She hated it and did it anyway. That is also a kind of endurance. South Pass came quiet, no canyon, no trumpets. The earth just made a decision to let you across and didn't brag about it. "This is the place," Joseph said, and even O'Rourke took off his hat. "Atlantic that way," Joseph said, and pointed with his chin. "Pacific that way." Ruth turned in a circle and giggled because the wind was a trickster, and it braided her hair with dust like a cousin. On the far side, the sweet water ran cold and clear, a knife that had learned how to be gentle. They forded without drama, and it felt like the river had decided to approve their project. Approval is not the same as safety. They all knew it at a noon stop. A Caldwell wagon broke a brake pin on a slope and slid into a low pine with a crack that sounded like a door slamming. On a conversation. No one was hurt, but the wagon tongue had a split that made men frown the way carpenters do when they see a fault that has too much ambition. Elias and Josiah set to work with lashings and a spare bolt and wood that wanted to cooperate. "We'll nurse it to Fort Hall," Josiah said. After that, prayer. That night, under a sky that had forgotten clouds, they ate the last of the dried apples because Nora wanted to taste Illinois while she... Elias checked the wheels, laid his palm flat against the hub, and felt heat that meant friction but also meant motion. He turned to Jonah and handed him the stick for the near ox. "Your lead today," he said, and Jonah grew half an inch. In front of Ilias's eyes, they rolled toward a sky that had sharpened its teeth. Asterisk, the snake, the cutoff, and the storm that changed the math Fort Hall didn't look like a fort so much as a bargain struck with weatherlow buildings. A palisade tired of pretending it could stop wind, a square of ground pocked by hooves and boots that had measured miles. Prices were a sermon on scarcity. Flour cost the future. Coffee cost your best story. Sugar was a rumor half the time, and a jewel the rest. O'Rourke and Josiah moved among the barrels and bins like men in a ship's hold. Elias counted coins in his head and felt the velvet pouch lighten without his hand touching it. Nora, one but steady on her feet now, pressed a thumb to the seam of a sack and judged quality by what it whispered back into her skin. "We'll take this one," she said, and the trader knew better than to argue. Frontier women had become a guild of their own. News blew in with the same dust that pricked the eyes. A trapper with a fox-guard cheek said an early storm had iced the passes. A driver hauling a string of mules swore by a new line overland that shaved Dayslander Road for some Hastings chatter for others, shortcut named like a dare. Joseph stood quietly at O'Rourke's elbow until the boasting quieted, then said, "Fast road takes fast meat, leaves bones." O'Rourke spat and looked at the sky. "We'll keep the road that remembers feet," he said. The company pushed into the Snake River country, where sage spread like its own ocean and the air wore a dry edge. The river didn't keep one channel. It braided itself like a girl's hair in a hurry, then unbraided just to see who was watching. Sand took men by the ankles. The sound of wheels changed. Spoke and Hub learned a new vocabulary: grit, grind, sing. They walked before dawn to steal cool from the day. By noon the sun slammed down. Pennyroyal and bear grease made the camp smell like an herb garden that had lost an argument. Mosquitoes still found wrists and elbows. "They like my blood best," Ruth announced, proud of an honor Hester didn't want bestowed. "They like anyone who forgets to smear grease again," Hester said, smearing Ruth's arms with the briskness of a woman who had given up delicacy the same year she gave up sleep. Camps fell into ritual. Miss Evans drew a crooked map in dust. For the children, Independence to Kearny, Kearny to Laramie, Laramie to Hall, Hall to the far names she said like spells. Blue Mountains, Columbia, Willamette. "Spell that one," she told Jonah, and he did, slow and stubborn until the letters lay where they were told. Liddy Bradley sat with Ruth and made a cornhusk doll with black thread hair and a dress cut from the hem of Liddy's own. "For luck," she said. "My ma says you can make luck if you don't get picky about the ingredients." They reached American falls under a sky the color of nails. You could feel voltage gathering across the skin like ants in a fit. Wind arrived first, shoving wagons sideways as if it resented their shape. Then the clouds let go. Hail the size of marbles strafed. Canvas oxen rolled white eyes and leaned against nothing. Covers tight. A rourke shouted, and the circle pulled in until it felt like the company could have shared one breath if it had to. Lightning hunted the ridge and found it often. The air smelled like tin and rain and the beginning of a story men would tell wrong in saloons for 30 years. Elias and Josiah ran a rope along the inner arc of wagons and tied off every cover they could reach. Jonah learned what it felt like to have his hands stop belonging entirely to him, numb and strong at the same time. A sensation he would remember. When he was old and storms were just weather again. A gust picked up the Bradley wagon cover and tried to wear it like a cape. Hester was there before the wind finished its thought. One hand on Liddy's shoulder, the other tightening a knot that would have held a mule if mules respected knots. "Breathe," she said to the girl, though no one could hear his own lungs. In that hammering air, then the hail quit like a drummer who'd heard the captain say, "Enough." Rain stayed. It softened the world so suddenly the camp grew quiet to hear it. The snake rose at its edges, not enough to take something, just enough to remind everything that it could. They counted heads. Everyone answered. Relief made coffee. Tastes like cake. In the morning, the plain glittered like someone had spilled a bag of glass and then forgiven you for it. Wheel ruts ran wide and shallow in the soft ground. A rourke moved them early and fast, trying to repay the debt storm. Had written on their schedule, midday brought a test. The company had to choose between hugging the river's lazy elbow or cutting across a bench of country that Joseph said would save hours at the price of sweat. The bench was a tilted table of basalt and scrub that rolled like the back of some sleeping animal. "Oxen hate rock," Josiah said. "So do wheels." "Rock hates oxen less than water hates fools," Joseph replied, and Elias saw a rourke's mouth twitch. Decision made. The bench taught humility. The first ascent demanded everything the teams had and then asked for 10% more. Wheels spun. Men set their shoulders behind spokes and pushed. Women lent hands without making speeches about custom. Ruth and Liddy carried armfuls of brush to lay under skids where the ground turned to grease. Miss Evans counted the rhythm heave, 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 and even the animals seemed to find the math of it at the top. The wind changed its mind twice and then settled on roar, but the view brought the price snake looping silver in the distance. Cottonwoods sketching ovals of shade far below, the line of their company's wagons making a white thread on the earth that reminded Elias of stitching. They were sewing themselves west. He hoped the cloth would hold. Nora walked that afternoon with Joseph, measuring her breath for the first time in days without thinking about it. Fever felt like a book she could finally set down. "Your medicine," Joseph said, nodding toward. "The tin where the quinine rode tastes like a bad joke." "Then it and I are kin," Nora said, and Joseph smiled with his eyes, which was how you knew a smile on the trail had been earned. Toward evening, a band of bannock riders appeared on a low ridge and watched them with the stillness of carved figures. A rourke raised an open hand. Joseph rode up the slope alone and spoke in a voice the wind didn't catch. His hands did the talking half the time, which told Elias that some languages were young enough to still be built in the air. The riders eased down and traded strips of smoked trout for coffee and needles. A woman with a baby at her breast touched Ruth's cornhusk doll and nodded approval. Ruth, flustered with pride, offered to trade it. The woman laughed and handed it back, then tucked a little leather pouch into Ruth's palm sage seeds, light as reasoning. Plant, Joseph translated. When you're settled. That night the fire was neighborly. Hester told a story about delivering a girl 2 springtimes ago, when the river had been full of drowned trees, and men had been too sick to help. The child came into a world that didn't deserve her, and made it better by making noise, she said, and everyone laughed softly, because they wanted that to be the moral wherever they were going. Near midnight. The wind quit like a stagehand. The stars came out with the relief you feel when someone who talks too much leaves a party. Elias lay under the wagon and listened for trouble and heard only his family breathing. He thought of his mother's ring in its pouch, of the tree names he'd said to Nora in the fever hours, of the way the company had become less a collection of wagons and more a single animal with many legs. He slept, and morning found them farther west just because they'd lived through the night. They rolled again into a day that smelled of sun-warmed sage and the ache in every ankle. The volcano stone underfoot wore dimples from ancient water. This country remembers flood, Joseph said, even when it's thirsty. By late afternoon, they were angled toward a low pass that promised to put them on a line that crossed the Blue Mountains where the road, rumor claimed, behaved itself. Clouds were already bruising the horizon. Storm again, Jonah asked, shoulders squared like the question might be dared into changing its mind. Not the same kind, Elias said. The air had that hollowness he now knew meant snow was rehearsing. O'Rourke gathered the leaders when they stopped. We stay moving tomorrow, he said. If the sky starts writing in white, we get. The meadow of white silent snow arrived like a rumor and turned to law before noon. At first it was a dab of white on sage tips, a lace that wind teased apart. Then flakes learned ambition, fattened, multiplied, and came with a purpose that made conversation seem wasteful. The trail began to hide from itself, ruts softened, landmarks went vague. Timber, Joseph said, chin indicating a darker line ahead. Meadow beyond. Water, shelter. The company leaned into it. Men broke trail with shovels and boots. Oxen pushed and then stalled and then pushed again, sides heaving steam you could write your name in if you were rude enough. Ruth and Liddy rode in the wagon for once, blankets up to their noses, eyes huge. Miss Evans took attendance twice an hour just by looking. She'd learned to count hats faster than heads. The meadow opened like a hand ringed by timber, a creek sulking at its edge. The ground a quilt of hummocks, now under a clean new sheet. Circle in tight, O'Rourke ordered. Keep stock, to the lie. No heroes, no foolishness. We'll praise both in better weather. They made a windbreak out of what they had: wagons, brush, will, and cussedness. Elias, Josiah, and Jonah cut saplings and drove them in for a second fence. Hester stacked snow into a wall and packed it with the assurance of a woman who had seen snow learn to behave if you told it to with your hands. Miss Evans assigned children to fetch kindling, to mind fire, to hold younger children's fear in pockets where it couldn't fall out. By dusk, camp was a small engine burning in a white world. Snow lilted past the edge of the circle and reconsidered. Inside, flames wrote orange on canvas and faces. Nora's color held. The quinine tin sat like a sentinel by the cookbox. "You'll still take it," Hester said, as if daring the fever to try an encore. Nora took it, made the face you make when you lick a nail, and smiled anyway. Rations, O'Rourke announced, and nobody argued. Flour counted by handful, beans counted by nights. The children learned to make bread that was mostly hope and a little chemistry. Coffee got thin enough to see a future through. Bacon grease became currency. You could waterproof a boot with it, soften leather, make beans, pretend they remembered pigs. Night pressed close and quiet. The usual prairie choir rip hum murmur had taken its show to a warmer room. The silence had weight. You could pick it up and put it on your shoulder if you were lonely. Jonah lay near the fire and watched sparks take reckless trips upward, then fade. Elias listened for the peculiar creak of wood under snow, for the sound canvas makes right before it decides to stop being a roof. He heard both and walked the line twice before sleep found him in pieces and agreed to stitch them. Morning brought a sky the color of pewter and a meadow that had swallowed its own contours. O'Rourke sent the men to the timber for more wood, sent the boys to stamp a path around the circle to keep snow from taking liberties with thresholds. Hester visited every wagon, checking cheeks, fingers, toes. Frostbite can be shy before it's cruel. She unshied it with a briskness that made children yelp and then smile because the hurt meant they were keeping parts. There is always a birth, when the trail wants to remind you it doesn't belong to sorrow alone. The Pruitt's baby came at noon on the second storm day. Hester's hands, and Miss Evans's steady voice, and Nora's warm water, and the Pruitt mother's grit, braided into a rope that pulled a wailing girl into a world that did not deserve her and would be better for having her anyway. They named her Temperance for the covenant they intended to make with patience. Hester declared the name a fine coat a child could grow into. Ruth watched with fascination, kept at a respectful distance. Later, she drew Temperance on the back of her map circle for head, little fists like punctuation. Liddy wrote her own name under it, and then Temperance's, and under that we stayed warm. On the third day, the weather tried to make a deal, then didn't. The wind eased, the flakes turned smaller, then the ceiling lowered again and snow spooled thick and steady. Food turned to math. O'Rourke wrote a tally on a board. Flour, beans, coffee, bacon, shared meat, and a column for found. Miss Evans took children to the tree line to shake snow from boughs and look for winter berries and for sign hare, spruce hen, Jonah. And Josiah set snares with knots that learned quick. That night, the men argued softly around the captain's fire. Some said wait, some said move. Joseph listened and ate beef jerky like it was a sentence with no punctuation. If we wait, Josiah said, we'll eat seed we mean to plant. If we go, Peterson said, we bury someone on a slope. Joseph spat into the snow and watched the black spot disappear. There is a way down, he said at last. Not wagon road. Trail my people use with horses. Steep ropes, trees to tie. Hard, true, how hard? O'Rourke asked. Hard enough to make you honest, Joseph said. They slept on it, or did their best. In the hour before dawn, silence. Changed less a blanket, more a held breath. Elias woke Nora with a hand on her shoulder. She looked at him and then at the canvas above, tugging politely at its ropes, and nodded. We go, she said. The vote was quick. Fear does that to a company that has decided to continue being a company. O'Rourke tucked the tally board under his arm like a shield and said, lighten again. Groans followed, but no mutiny. They left behind the last chair with a back, a mirror no one had looked in for a month, a box of books that Miss Evans touched like a wake, a cast-iron kettle, too heavy for rope work. Hester affixed a note to the cache. Company of 14 wagons read, Bradley, Pruitt, Peterson, Bell, Evans. Others headed for Joseph's cut to the river. Weather, poor. Spirits, good, because lying to weather never made sense. By mid, they reached the lip of a narrow ravine. Snow had laid a tablecloth over a table with bad manners. You could hear water somewhere underneath, sulking in a stone room. Joseph rode the edge, reading trees for soundness and slope for treachery. He picked anchor points with a hunter's frown. Here, here, here. He said it like the rope itself had asked to be useful. Ropes came out some hemp, some rawhide, twisted till it forgot it had ever been anything else. Josiah rigged a brake with a snubbing post and a wrap that would bite just so. Elias tested knots with slow, deliberate violence until each understood its job. Jonah's hands were split and bleeding and proud, O'Rourke said, one wagon at a time. Men on ropes, women and children at the side. No one standing where a break would turn you into a cautionary tale. The Bradley wagon went first. It creaked like a church, settling on its foundations, and then began to slide with a dignity you could admire if you weren't the one on the rope. Liddy held her mother's hand, chin up, as if the ravine were a strict teacher and she meant to pass. The wagon hesitated at a ledge, then moved again, wheels finding purchase where the world offered little. At the bottom, men cheered, not loud, just enough to tell the frightened parts of themselves they'd done it. The Reed wagon was third. Elias took the rear snub. Josiah and O'Rourke bore down on the sidelines. Jonah walked beside the near wheel, voice low to the ox, as if words had weight halfway down. A buried rock translated itself into the wheel's path. The wheel climbed, slid, threatened to turn foolish. Elias hauled, feeling the rope eat his palms. The brake rapped, bit, held. The wagon corrected like a man who has just remembered his own first name. At the bottom, Elias put his head on the buckboard and laughed once because the alternative wanted the same muscles. One more wagon and then the next. The Pruitts last because the baby was new and the mother softer than steel, though not by much. When they were all down, snow was still stitching a veil between tree and air, but the ravine made a lane, and the creek was more friend than foe. Joseph grinned then, big and honest, the first time Elias had seen that exact expression. Now we walk, Joseph said. Now we make up time. They camped that night in timber with the ravine holding wind on a leash. O'Rourke scratched a new tally in the frost on his tin plate and counted it a ledger of debt and grace. Temperance Pruitt slept in a box lined with wool and corn husk, faced the calm of milk. Miss Evans read by firelight from a book she hadn't packed and laughed when the page she thought was geography turned out to be a recipe for vinegar pie. We'll save it, Nora said. We'll make one when the oven is ours. Where? Will we put the oven? Ruth asked. In a kitchen that knows your name, Elias said. And Ruth fell asleep, deciding where she would keep the cups. The meadow they'd left was already a dream. The path ahead was a line drawn by people who had never been given permission to draw. The company slept in their clothes and woke to a thinner sky and a promise you could chew, move, and you might live. Stay, and the snow would teach your name to the stones and call that memory kindness. They moved. Ropes, knuckles, and a creek that took its own way. The creek they followed wasn't interested in their convenience. It shouldered right against rock, then swerved into a clutch of order as if daring wagons to learn shrubbery as a language. But it kept a temper, and for that the company thanked whatever small God kept ravines from ambition. They rigged a dozen short lowers, each a miniature of the long descent snub, wrap, hold, persuade. Elise's hands were a map of new skin and old mistakes. Josiah's forearms looked like a blacksmith's, always deroped with muscle, peppered with old burns and now added rope burn as a motif. Jonah's voice grew the low patience that makes animals understand that a boy has become a man who owns his tone at a bend. A boulder sat where a road should have been if the earth had ever promised roads. The Peterson wagon had to squeeze by, in a way that required imagination and profanity in equal measure. Midway through, the right rear wheel kissed the boulder and then tried to climb it, not a tall climb, but tall enough to turn a wagon into an opinion about gravity. The off-ox balked. The near-ox, loyal to a fault, leaned too hard. The wagon's bed tipped to a degree that made Nora inhale like she was learning to breathe for the first time. Hold, O'Rourke thundered, and holding is a verb that can save lives. Men bore down, the snub sang. Hester yanked a child back from where a spill would have made them a statistic. The wheel slid off the rock and dropped into ruts that felt like comfort. Everyone exhaled like a choir dot 2 miles downstream. A deadfall had barricaded the creek. Water hissed underneath, annoyed. Not crossable, Joseph said. We go around, up the bench. Up O'Rourke repeated with the dislike of a man who had made peace with down. If the meadow had taught them waiting, the bench taught angles. They used brush and arm and will to build a kind of road. Ruth and Liddy carried twigs like ants, hands red inside their mittens. Miss Evans recorded who worked where and later read the list aloud in the tone teachers have that prevents anyone from deciding they weren't present. On the far side of the bench, the world opened in a slow hush. Snow thinned to a powder that behaved if you asked nice. The trees acquired that far country, spacing less tangle, more statement. Late afternoon light slid between trunks and sheets that looked like glass hung to dry. Joseph rode a ridge and lifted his chin. There, he said, there was the big valley shouldering in from the west, a bowl slung low where weather brewed, but where men and women could stand on slope and name things without running out of breath to do it. And beyond, not seen but felt, the pull of a river with its own ideas about empire. They didn't reach it that day. The ground insisted on small steps. They made camp at a place where pine had fallen long ago and offered dry heartwood to a saw that sang a quick song. O'Rourke sent 2 men ahead at dawn with Joseph to scout the last rundown. The rest broke camp, methodically, the fatigue kind where movement is easier than stopping. Temperance Pruitt squawked, drank, slept. And EJ, as Jonah, was now quietly called by half the company alias Junior, when he didn't hear the junior. Because there wasn't one grinned at the baby in ways he would deny. The scouts came, back with faces that were both worried and pleased. Trails there, Joseph said. Steep, rock in 3 places that will ask for blood if you don't give it sweat. Creek falls quick at the end. Ferryman, ferry who? Josiah asked. Man lives at the river, Joseph said. Wife is Nez Perce. Charges, coin, and stories both. Stories we got, O'Rourke said. Coin we've turned to flour. But we'll find both. The final descent was a chapter written in rope and breath. They took it slow enough to make a St. Chew a thumbnail. 3 times a wheel tried to be a hoof. Twice a wagon tongue wanted to become a spear. Once an ox fell to its knees and stayed there in the pose of a tired prayer until Jonah leaned against its neck and spoke to it in the voice his father had found under independence, low and persuasive, and the animal stood because boys and men and oxen all sometimes need the same reminder. You are still able at a shelf where rocks stepped down in a way that had never imagined wheels. The Pruitt wagon's load shifted. The barrel with precious coffee watt was left of its lid. Ruth saw it go and did not scream, because screaming doesn't change gravity. Elias grabbed and missed. Josiah grabbed and caught, and then had to choose between saving the barrel and saving the hand caught under it. He saved the hand, which turned crimson and sang in a register no instruments knew. The barrel thumped, rolled off the ledge, burst at the seam. Coffee went dark in snow like blood in a battlefield. Everyone stared as if they had lost a church. Good choice, Hester said to Josiah, whose breath trembled but whose eyes didn't. We can drink chicory when we have to. We can't grow new fingers yet. Josiah smiled crooked. Smithing is a two-hand habit, he said. By late afternoon, they reached a notch in the ridge where the descent turned merciful. Trees watched. Like polite neighbors, the wind came up from the big valley and tasted of wet stone rather than ice. Joseph stopped at a low overlook, and there it was, an unrolling plain, a silver ribbon cutting its own line, broad and implacable and glittering like arrogance. The Columbia. Ruth gasped. Liddy said a word she'd heard from a mule skinner, and then clapped a hand to her mouth, eyes round. Miss Evans whispered, geography, as if the book had admitted the map was real. They made camp early because reverence is a kind of preparation. Elias walked a little apart with Nora, their hands inside one mitten hers, had his bare hand like a foolish boy's. Do you hear it? She asked. Only when I stop trying, he said. The river's sound was distance made into music. Morning brought a trail in the valley that oscillated between decent and mean. A rain blew through that wasn't interested in snow's drama, just a steady argument with canvas that no one had the energy to take personally. The oxen chewed their cud with the professional resignation of beasts that had seen better grass and worse weather. They found the trading shack where Joseph had promised it would be 3 buildings, arranged like a conversation around a dock pinned to the bank with timbers that had been persuaded from trees with more force than friendship. The ferryman was not what stories required. He wasn't grizzled so much as sunburnt to a permanent leather. His wife had the calm center of someone who expected men to do silly things and had decided not to be angered at it. He named a price. O'Rourke named a counter. The wife named the real number with a glance that said she had patience for neither inflation nor stinginess. A deal in coffeeless coin was made, and a deal in stories took shape around the fire that night. They would ferry wagons, one at a time. Animals, 2 by 2, like a book Elias remembered. People, when the raft felt like it wasn't being dared. A rock. Drew lots, the Bells first, the Petersons next. The Reeds after that. The raft was a platform with the stubborn grace of a thing that had decided not to drown. The ferryman's wife handled the near rope like she'd married a man and a river and kept both faithful. The Bell wagon slid aboard. Josiah flexed his bandaged hand and smiled at Ruth as if to say, this is what hands are for, work, not words. The raft leaned into current and then straightened under the pull of ropes, strung across like a harp for a god you didn't trust to keep time. Halfway over, a log loped down the current with the laziness of a big thing that didn't have to hurry. The ferryman yelled a warning. The raft bumped, pivoted, steadied. Everyone exhaled. The far bank grew from promise to ground, and then to slope, and then to a landing where Josiah and 2 other men set chocks under wheels with a speed that suggested practice. The reed's turn came. Elias drove on with a care he reserved for furniture that already knew it was heirloom. Jonah braced near the near ox's head. Nora kept one hand on Ruth's shoulder and the other on the sideboard, as if touch could make wood remember its job. The raft surged, heaved, slid, obeyed. In the middle of the river, Elias felt an urge to look down. He didn't. He looked up, at a sky that found a way to be both grey and full of light. He looked ahead to a bank that meant ground on the other side of a long idea. He looked at Jonah, who looked back at him with a grin that had more courage than sense, and enough sense to be forgiven for the courage. They made it. They made it, and it wasn't triumph so much as relief, dressed in wet wool, that night. The company stood on the west bank of a river that had separated them from a part of themselves, and listened to a rourke say less than anyone expected and more than anyone needed. "We're near," he said, "and near has its own dangers. Mud will eat wheel and patience both, but winter is behind us now more than ahead." They slept like people who had been held up against a truth and were found equal to it. In the morning, rain came the way it does in the river country, thin and patient and everywhere. The road promised mud, and then delivered like a champion. Wheels wore collars of clay that wanted to be statues. Men and women put their shoulders to spokes and sang without noticing. They watched Joseph ride back toward his own people, and thought different thoughts about what it means to belong to land that is teaching you how to live. Ahead lay a pass not worthy of song, but still able to surprise a last rise, a last argument, with gravity, a last chance for wheels to prove they remembered their business. Beyond that, a valley that held green like a secret. They set out for it with hands that had learned rope, with feet that had learned patience, with hearts that had learned not to quit on the hour before weather changes its mind. The mud road, and the last past the rain in the river country had opinions. It didn't fling itself like prairie storms or sharpen like ice. It arrived steady, democratic, intent on visiting every canvas seam, every boot seam, every thought that tried to stay dry. Ruts grew into trenches. Trenches turned into ditches. Ditches began to look like arguments the land had been waiting to win. "Welcome to the West," the ferryman's wife had said, almost kindly. "You'll learn the names of mud." They learned them, slick, where the surface pretended friendship and then pulled a boot to the ankle. Suck, where the earth took a grip and refused to negotiate. Grease, a thin smear that made a wagon skate, like a bad idea. Jonah named a new kind of mud that belonged only to wheel hubs. When they wore collars of clay, so thick the spokes looked like they were wearing coats, he called it coat mud, and Ruth laughed until she had to catch her breath. They followed the tributary the ferryman had pointed with 2 fingers and no explanation. The valley tightened and then breathed again, pine pressing in and then letting go. The trail was a ribbon of other people's decisions and last week's mistakes. Branches hung low and slapped canvas like impatient teachers. The oxen leaned into the yokes with a patience that comes either from holiness or from not having the imagination to do anything but pull. "Pass ahead," Joseph had said, lifting his chin before he rode away. Not fierce, but stubborn. O'Rourke said a shorter day's march and a longer morning. "We start at grey," he said. "We eat standing. We push. We do not lose wagons to mud because mud has no appetite for iron. It only eats time. The first incline came at mid-morning, a slope glazed with a film of clay the color of old pennies. Elias had seen barn floors slick after threshing, boys losing their feet and laughing. This was that floor tilted like a dare. O'Rourke scouted the grade on foot, boots cutting half-moons. Chains, he ordered. Brush under. The men and older boys cut fir bows and laid a green carpet over the worst sections, making grip where the trail had forgotten how. The bell wagon went first, because Josiah liked to set a tone. He took the near wheel himself, shoulder to spoke, voice calm and stubborn. The oxen pushed, the bows bit, the chain sang. The wagon climbed as if the ground had been persuaded that day to be hospitable. At a slicker patch, the rear end slewed sideways a foot, and then remembered its business. Next, O'Rourke barked, and the rhythm began. Lay brush, chain, push, breathe. Lay brush, chain, push, breathe. The company became a machine with many hands. Miss Evans had the children gather armfuls of smaller branches back down the grade for the next team. Hester planted a bucket at the hilltop and made everyone swallow a mouthful water, rationed but not romanticized. Men can't push when they're stubborn thirsty. Halfway up, the reed wagon hit a place where the mud's appetite returned. The right rear sank, then the left. The bed took on a tilt that suggested a future where canvas might meet ground in a very personal way. Elias felt the wheel slip past his knee in slow motion and put his shoulder in so hard the world narrowed to wood and weight. Hold your line, he told Jonah, who had the oxen thinking straight thoughts. Jonah planted his boots and made sounds to the team that weren't words, but were language. Brush, Hester shouted, and 3 boys shoved boughs under the rear. Rim until green grabbed clay. Chain, Josiah yelled, and O'Rourke threw a loop with a grace you only earn by surviving apprenticeships under worse captains than he had been. The chain checked the incorrect motion. Pain shot up Ilias's spine like a lantern suddenly lit, and then the wheel climbed that inch that meant the next inch would be available at the top. Nora sat down flat in the road and laughed the laughter of a woman who'd held her breath for several minutes and was now borrowing interest. "Do you remember our kitchen?" she asked Elias. "How the floor sloped just enough you had to chase the potatoes when they rolled?" Elias smiled, sweating through his shirt in a cold rain. "That was practice," he said. The trail eased. For a mile, gliding along a ridge, where the dark firs leaned together like elders, murmuring. Then it tilted again, sharper, into a cut where the last of the summer wagons had churned clay to soup, and the autumn rains had reconsidered the meaning of structure. O'Rourke stopped and stared, measuring the thing. "We double team," he said finally. 2 ox teams per wagon. Men on spokes, nobody behind wheels. If it slides, let it, and we'll fix what breaks at the bottom. They did it. Teams were switched like parts. The milk cow went with the Peterson ox to make a pair that looked foolish until it pulled like. As St. Ruth stood with Liddy on a side bank, with Miss Evans's hand on each of their shoulders, and they counted breaths out loud so the children who were afraid could borrow the count. Temperance Pruitt fussed, decided the rhythm of pushing was exactly the lullaby she preferred, and slept again in her box. At the worst point, the bell wagon skated into a rut so deep the bed kissed clay. The near wheel dug. The off wheel spun. Josiah's injured hand flared crimson, and he grinned like a man who had beaten a small god at a trick. Again, he shouted, and the company leaned, and the wheel climbed. and the wagon took the last yards like it had never thought to doubt itself at the pass's crest. The trail leveled and widened just enough to feel like a room where you could put down a thought and not lose it. The view wasn't spectacular, it was comforting. Ahead lay a decline that behaved like reason. Beyond the second ridge, a smudge of lighter green that could only be someone's field. Smoke threads, fences, the idea of ovens. Ruth saw the smoke first. They have chimneys, she whispered with reverence. Nora squeezed her hand. We will too, she said. They camped on the pass in a stand of fir that smelled like a memory of Christmas back in a state where winters made tidy decisions. The rain softened to a whisper, then to nothing. For the first time in days, you could hear the small sounds of a camp when it isn't braced for whether the scrape of a spoon in a pot. A low laugh that didn't look over its shoulder for trouble. The murmur of someone telling a story to a child who wasn't yet asleep and wasn't going to be for the length of that story. Elias mended the small tear in the canvas side, where a snag had tried to make itself into a door. He worked by lamplight because his hands didn't like stopping when there was light. Jonah watched, chin in hand. When we get there, Jonah said, will everything stop being work? No, Elias said, but some of the work will be ours on purpose. Near dawn, a fog came and then drifted aside like a stage curtain. The company rolled down the western slope into a light that felt warmer by 2 degrees and friendlier by 10. Birds called in voices that didn't sound like warning. The mud eased from suck to merely thick. The valley opened and kept opening until even O'Rourke's shoulders came down from their place near his ears. Around a bend, they saw it. A homestead that had been made out of trees, an intentional cabin, split rail fence, smoke straight up from a pipe. A woman stepped out with a loaf of bread wrapped in a cloth and a grin that was only half pity. I baked too much, she lied. Take this and pretend it's yours. Nora held the bread like a person holds an answered prayer. The children tore small pieces with the reverence of First Communion. Elias swallowed a bite and felt a muscle in his throat loosen that had been tight since independence. How far to the Willamette? O'Rourke asked. Because he couldn't help being a captain even with bread in his hand. 2 days the way you're going, the woman said. 1.5 if you cut across the marsh and don't mind losing a boot. We've got fewer boots than we started with, O'Rourke said, and the woman laughed. The last miles were not dramatic. They were the kind of miles that make a life small hills, puddles that pretended to be ponds, a creek that asked to be gotten across and then allowed it. The company spread a little and then gathered itself like a flock, unwilling to break the habit of moving as one. At a rise where the road ran between 2 stands of alder, the valley below widened into a green that didn't seem possible after months of brown, grey and white. Fields, orchards planted in straight lines like sentences with clear grammar. A river kinder in its curves than the ones that had tried to drown. The Valley of Smoke and bred the Willamette Valley was not a story. It was a place that asked for chores. That first day, it asked them to keep moving until they could put wheels on land that might be theirs. It asked them to accept kindness without fumbling it. It asked them to remember manners after months of eating with their hands and their nerves. They followed a road that had remembered how to be a road, firm enough to trust, crooked enough to be interesting. Smoke lifted from far cabins like fishing lines angled into a sky that had decided to be generous. At a junction where the main track bent toward a settlement they would later learn was Oregon City, O'Rourke stopped the train and gathered the heads of families. Claims are this way, he said, pointing west with his brim. We file when we can, but first we choose ground. Don't just take the first pretty meadow, walk the edges. Look for water that doesn't run away in August. Look for trees that are good for building and good for staying as trees. And think about neighbors you might want. He turned to the reeds as if he'd been holding the sentence for them. What's in your letters, Nora? Nora, who had the cousin's letters wrapped in oilcloth and kept dry through storms and ferry crossings and the time Ruth fell asleep with them under her, unfolded the top one. East of the main river, south of the falls, she read. A creek with clear water and stones you can step on, a bench with good sun and soil that doesn't quit if you don't. She smiled. He says the rain is a character and the summers smell like strawberries. They scouted that afternoon, or stayed with the wagons, like a man who had learned that decisions are easier when not everyone makes them at once. Elias walked with Nora and Jonah along a spur of track where wagon marks turned into deer sign and then into just the memory of feet. Ruth skipped and then didn't when she saw a woman stooping among low trees. The woman looked up, hand shading. Her eyes, blackberries, she said with a grin. I'll give you a handful if you promise not to ruin your supper. Ruth promised without consulting the fact that supper would likely be beans again, not ruinable. She took the berries in, both hands, purple juice slicking her fingers, and ate them with a seriousness that made the woman's grin deepen. You're new, the woman said to Nora. Welcome. I'm Eliza Shaw. We came last year by the mountain road that took the skin off our knuckles. She nodded toward the east where clouds liked to collect. You, by a road with opinions. Nora said. The women shared that quick look people share who have seen rooms collapse and stay standing. Eliza pointed them south. There's land down that way that doesn't flood even when the river gets ideas. A creek like a ribbon on a dress. You'll hear frogs by spring and think you own an orchestra. They found it toward sunset, the bench of ground that lifted. Just enough to keep a house out of winter's angle. A creek that spoke in a voice you didn't have to raise yours to hear. A stand of fir and maple that kept secrets like good neighbors. The grass had the lush look of a place that had not been asked to do too much yet. The soil under Ilias's boots felt like a promise made by somebody you actually trusted. What do you think? Ilias asked, because asking is a kind of ceremony. Nora walked to the water, knelt, and cupped a drink to her mouth. She closed her eyes and then opened them with that light he had seen the day they left Independence. I think this is the place, she said, and the words fit the air like they had been rehearsed. Jonah did a circle slowly, counting trees and imagining boards the way his father did. We can put the cabin here, he said, pointing to a spot. That caught morning light and afternoon shadow, garden there, barn down the slope where the ground's already a little packed. He looked at Elias. We can cut a raft of logs and float them from the bend. We'll keep the creek as a friend, not a tool, when we can, Elias said. And Jonah nodded like a person who had learned the difference between using and using. Up, Ruth stepped into the fringe of ferns and reached into her coat. She pulled out the little leather pouch Joseph had given her and untied the thong with careful fingers. Sage seeds slid into her palm, tiny as commas. Can I? She asked Nora, and Nora nodded. Ruth pressed a few into the damp soil at the edge of a sunny patch near the cabin's future, patted the ground as if comforting a child, and smiled like she had just told a secret to the land. He said they liked to be dared, she said softly. They walked back to the train with twilight in the trees. the air smelling like balsam and something sweet they couldn't name yet. O'Rourke heard their footsteps and read their faces. "You found it?" he said, and it wasn't a question. "We did," Ilya said. "South bench, clear water, trees that look like they can stand a winter without feeling betrayed." "Then we break the company tomorrow," O'Rourke said gently. It hit them like a soft blow, expected and still tender. "We'll go down together to the land office when the road's right and file what needs filing. But wagons go where homes tell them to now." There were tears, because people who had counted breaths through storms don't split without grief. Hester hugged Nora long, then stepped back and peered at her face like a physician reading weather signs. "You tell me if the fever even clears its throat," she said. "I've got Willow and patience." Miss Evans pressed a folded paper into Ruth's hand, the map the girl had been drawing on and around for a month. "Add your creek," Miss Evans said. "Write its name when it tells you." Ruth nodded solemnly, like she had been given a task by a queen. Josiah gripped Ilias's forearm first, then Jonah's. His injured hand was healing, but ugly. "I'll put a forge up nearer the settlement," he said. "Come find me when a hinge asks to be born." "You'll be sick of seeing me," Elias said. "I plan on it." Josiah's grin cut the sadness in half. They had a last supper as a train. Beans and a scrape of bacon, and Eliza Shaw somehow appearing again with a pie blackberries under a crust that really was a crust. "It's not proper," she apologized. "Shortening's thin this time of year." It tasted like the definition of proper. O'Rourke rose with his tin cup, and for once his voice had no edges. "I've led a long trail," he said. "Sometimes I led like a man who knows a map. Sometimes I led like a man who knows how to apologize afterward. You all made my job easier than I deserved. If any of you need a hand with a roof, I've got to." He sat. People began to stand. They spoke short on purpose. Praise is easier to carry when it doesn't come with flourishes. The Pruitts promised to visit with baby Temperance when she could laugh on command. The Petersons asked to borrow an auger once they were settled, because their own had learned to be a pry bar and refused to remember anything else. Miss Evans announced that school would meet under the big maple with the scar like a lightning bolt. On Sundays after meeting, and any afternoon that didn't ask for an emergency, morning broke with fog tucked into the low places. Like sleep that hadn't finished, the train rolled in pieces for the last time. At the split where the track to Oregon City walked left and the edges of new claims beckoned right, they halted and hugged the way people do when touching has to say what speech can't. Then, without ceremony, they turned and went. The reed wagon creaked down the path along the creek that was not yet their creek, but felt like it was waiting. They stopped where they'd stood the evening before. Ilya set the brake and laid his palm on the wheel hub with an old habit. Felt the warmth that meant motion and friction, and 1,000 small corrections had brought them here. "Home," Nora said. "Home," Jonah echoed. And the word fit differently in his deeper voice than it had in Ruth's or Elias's. They didn't unload fully that first day. Elias and Jonah cut saplings and threw up a lean-to against the side of the wagon to make a sheltered place to cook that wasn't canvas. Nora set the Dutch oven on stones and made a corn mush with a handful of the dried apples she'd hoarded. Since the divide, Ruth and Jonah carried water from the creek and didn't slop much after supper. Elias walked off paces for the cabin 12 by 16 to start. Room to add a shed later, a chimney at the north end out of stone they'd steal. From the creek's edge, he could see the logs notched, the corners locking, the roof shed to the weather. He felt the ache of all the work stack up in him like cordwood. And Elias tucked the bow into the corner. The wind took a breath and then let it out. The day ended with shoulders tired and hands raw, and a satisfaction that had nothing to do with miles. They were not alone. In the afternoon, Eliza Shaw's husband, Will, came by with a borrowed team and a grin that had seen sawdust, and helped drag 2 logs that had pretended to be immovable. He admired the bench, the angle to sun, the way the creek had decided to be a neighbor. "You'll want a ditch before the big rains," he said. "She'll jump her banks and invite herself to supper if you don't show her where the door is." Elias nodded, noting the ground's subtle slope with his eye. "Tomorrow afternoon," he said, "after we raise the next course." "Tomorrow afternoon," Will agreed, as if it were a date between men with dignity. At dusk, Will pointed with his chin toward the stand of maples. "Meeting on Sunday," he said, "at the big maple with the lightning scar. Bring something to sit on if you want to sit." Nora smiled. "We'll be there. We can stand, too. We've had practice." When they lay down that night, the creek's voice had become part of the way sleep sounded. The land wasn't a stranger anymore. It was someone you would grow old with, someone whose moods you'd learn and forgive, someone who would take your best years and give back a crop in exchange. The valley of smoke and bread had turned into a particular corner with a pine bow tucked in a wall and 4 logs that agreed with each other. A door waited to be cut. A window waited to be stretched with oiled paper. A stove waited to be improvised until iron could be afforded. A life waited, with a to-do list so long it made Elias laugh at nothing in particular. Tomorrow he would begin to shorten it. 1 sore stroke at a time. Asterisk, raising walls, borrowed tools. And the first warm room, the first week on their claim, was a calendar, made of sore muscles. Morning, fell trees. Midday, drag, peel, notch. Afternoon, set, true, spike. Evening, cook, mend, plan. Night, sleep like people who haven't earned the luxury of dreaming yet. They learned every sound the creek made between dawn and midnight. They learned the way light moved across their clearing, sliding from the firs like a hand leaving a shoulder. They learned the small habits of neighborly wildlife juncos, counting seeds under the edge of camp. A pair of blue jays who appeared wherever the crumbs did. A raccoon who wandered in brazenly and was stared down by Nora until he reconsidered his options. The walls rose to Elias's shoulder by the 4th day. He and Jonah worked a rhythm into the notcher scribe the saddle. Shave it with the broad axe, check for daylight, shave again, fit, hammer the pin. The sound of a pin going home is a satisfaction that can make a man forget for a second that his back hurts like an old debt. "We're getting greedy," Jonah said, grinning through sawdust. "We put 1 log up, and I already want to see the next." "Greed for walls is permitted," Elias said. "Some sins become virtues when you're building." Neighbors arrived as if the woods had decided a barn raising would happen whether or not there was a barn. Will Shaw brought a cant hook and a boy not much older than Jonah who had a way with teams that made the oxen forget. They'd met the Reeds. Eliza brought a kettle that had capacity beyond reason and a stew that tasted like someone had turned several deer and a garden into a thesis on nourishment. "You eat while my man pretends he knows how to set a sill," she said, and Will rolled his eyes the way a married man rolls them when he is pleased by afternoon. The 4 walls were tall enough that the cabin had a voice. Wind made a tone. At the doorway gap, the creek echoed inside differently now, the corners catching the music and sending it back filtered through the smell of cedar. Ruth stepped inside and turned twice, solemn. "This is the first warm room," she announced. "It will be," Nora said, "when we say so enough days in a row." Hester came by with a packet of oiled paper for the window because she had a storehouse of things she claimed fell out of the sky when needed. "You'll want glass someday," she said. "Until then, grease that paper and pretend it keeps the worst of the wet out and lets the light be polite." Miss Evans arrived with a stack of slates wrapped in a cloth and a borrowed primer that had done life as a doorstop. She looked at the rising wall and smiled the slow smile of a woman who had taught children in rooms made of brick and in rooms made of hope and knew which she preferred. "Sunday after meeting," she said, "under the lightning maple, I plan to teach the alphabet to any child who can pretend to sit. Adults who need to relearn how to read without a newspaper's lies are welcome to." "Will there be sums?" Jonah asked with mock dread. "Only the kind you can use," Miss Evans said. "Distance, yield, how many boards a tree makes, how many neighbors a valley needs." Elias and Will set the doorframe by lantern. The corners plumbed true under the weight of willing hands, and the threshold sat like a promise no foot would cross carelessly. "We'll hang a blanket till you can plane a door proper," Will said. "Winter wants to see if you mean it." "We do," Elias said simply. The next day, the chimney foundation began stones poached from the creek, each heavy as a decision. Jonah fetched and stacked while Elias laid them in a pattern that was less pattern than prayer. Mortar, thin as soup, tried to be helpful. "I wish for brick," Jonah confessed. "So do the 3 other men upstream," Will said, who had come by to return a cant hook he had borrowed the day before. "There's a kill nearer the settlement. We'll trade for their seconds when their pride runs ahead of their product." They raised the ridgepole on the 6th day. For men on ropes and a chorus of instructions that somehow did not amount to an argument. When it settled, the woods seemed to nod. They ran rafters and set the first rung of shake cedar, split thin and sweet. Roofwork is the kind that invites falling, so Nora watched with the particular quiet that wives use when they are counting breaths. Elias came down with all his in order and grinned at the look on her face. "I grant you 1 risk a day," she said. "Spend it on roofs, not on drowning cattle or wrestling logs." "Noted," Elias said, and kissed her in front of Will Shaw, who pretended to be very interested in a knot that evening. They made vinegar pie because Miss Evans had read the recipe aloud in the snow and Nora had promised. Flour was thin, but there was enough for a crust, and Eliza had sent over a splash of vinegar with a note that said, "For pretending." The pie came out of the Dutch oven with a smell that said home more loudly than any sermon. They ate it, on chips of cedar that would later be shims, and Ruth licked her fork with a seriousness that would have made her grandmother proud or appalled. On Sunday, they walked to the big maple with the lightning scar. Half the valley had had the same idea. Men in shirts without coats stood in the grey light with their hats held, and women in patched skirts stood with their hands busy inside their aprons, and children stood with their eyes busy. A preacher with a voice like river stones spoke about gratitude without inventing much. He said, "We're here," and somehow made it sound like a full theology after the amen. Miss Evans clapped her hands once, and children sorted themselves into a circle like iron filings finding a magnet. Ruth sat with Liddy, Temperance Pruitt, asleep across Hester's knees like a borrowed blessing, and they learned letters drawn on slate with chalk that had pretended to be limestone before its demotion. A boy named Alec tried to flirt with the alphabet and failed and then succeeded. Jonah leaned against a maple and watched, like a man who had been told to keep an eye on things and liked being obeyed by everything he could see. The land office trip came a week later, once the roof was tight enough to shed and the door hole was covered enough to keep out the worst of the weather. Elias and Nora rode into the settlement with O'Rourke, who had promised to wait for all of his people, because captains don't stop being captains just because the route has turned into addresses. The donation land paperwork was a stack of forms pretending to be a ritual. A clerk took down names and asked questions that felt odd after months of answering only to whether age, origin, number of children living, number buried the clerk. Didn't flinch asking the shape of the claim, whether husband and wife both meant to sign and therefore secure the full aside offered by men who had never seen a wagon rut. We both sign, Nora said before Elias could. The clerk raised an eyebrow and then remembered where he lived and lowered it again. He pushed the papers their way and handed them a pen that had scratched 100 ambitions. Nora wrote with a steady hand. Elias did, too. The clerk sprinkled sand, shook it off, and stamped the pages with a seal that made a sound like a hammer tapping a nail in the right place. On the way out, they bought a small sack of seed wheat with the last of the silver and a packet of garden seed with a promise to make value later. They looked at glass panes they couldn't afford and iron stoves they couldn't lift. And then they saw Josiah at a stall with a forge cobbled from a barrel, smiling as he sold hinges that made other men's doors possible. "You'll have your hinges next week," he said, before Elias could speak. "I made a list after I looked at your frame without asking. Forgive me for the imposition." "Forgiven," Elias said. "Impose often." Rain began again on the ride home, soft and sure. They reached the cabin before full dark. Jonah had kept the fire, and the inside air had that lovely contradiction smoke and warmth, damp kept just on the far side of harmless. They hung a blanket across the door hole and sat on boxes and a stump and a plank propped on a crate that would later be a shelf. Nora ladled stew. Ruth announced that the sage seeds had put up 2 shy green ears, twins, she decided. Jonah showed a handle he had whittled for the draw knife and declared it the first thing he'd made that would last more than a week. "Tomorrow," Elias said, "we lay the hearthstones and chink the north wall proper. And dig the ditch Will told us to dig," Nora said, "before the creek decides it likes our root cellar. And I start school," Ruth added, touching her slate like it was a talisman. "Miss Evans says we will learn the histories of rivers, not just spelling. And I go see if Mr. Shaw needs help with his rafters," Jonah said, failing to hide the way his voice warmed saying rafters. "Then we'll all sleep unfairly hard," Elias concluded. They did. The creek kept on making its long, low argument. With gravity, the roof ticked as the last drops let go. The blanket over the door breathed in and out with the cabin, like a chest rising and falling. Elias lay awake for a while and listened, the way he had under the wagons on the plains. But the list of sounds he was monitoring was different now. He wasn't listening for coughs at 2 wagons down, or for the canvas to fail as a thunderhead practiced cruelty. He was listening for a roof that held, and for a fire that behaved, and for the small shifting noises of wood settling into the shape of a home. He closed his eyes with a feeling he had not had since a winter back in Illinois when money had been easier and the house had been almost warm. It was not safety. Safety is a story even the valley didn't tell. It was something plainer and more honest. Enough walls, enough food, enough neighbors, enough will to make tomorrow better than today by one board, one ditch, one lesson, one loaf. Morning would come, asking for more. He found himself glad to be there to hear it knock the rains. The ditch and a door that swung through the rain did not arrive the same way twice. Some mornings it came as a mist, thin as thread, beating on lashes and making the cedar shakes slick as fish. Some afternoons it shoved in from the west and bossed the trees. Some midnights it simply appeared, steady as a metronome, turning the creak into a longer sentence. The valley did not apologize for this. It introduced itself. Elias and Jonah dug the ditch before the weather made the argument for them. Will Shaw laid out the grade with a line, a stick, and that easy competence. Men pretend they don't admire in each other. Start high at the alder there, he said. Fall to the willow. Cut a curve that doesn't challenge the water's pride. They cut the sod, shoveled clay that stuck to the spade like a toddler that didn't want to be set down, lined the trench with cedar slabs, and opened it to the creek with a small ceremony that consisted of stepping back and letting physics keep its side of the deal. The next storm gave the ditch a christening. The creek rose, tried the door of the root cellar, found it locked by angle and intention, and took the path provided. Ruth stood under the eave and watched water gallop through the cut in a way that looked like joy if you liked hydraulics. We made a river's mind up for it, she said. Just a little. Nora ruffled her hair. We negotiated, she said. That's different. The chimney ate stones and mortar and opinion. By the second week, its throat drafted clean. Smoke rose straight when the wind allowed and made a curl over the roof's ridge when it did not. The first time a fire held in the hearth against a day of rain. Nora leaned close and warmed her palms like a woman who had outrun a winter and wanted proof that it knew it had lost. This is the first warm room, Ruth had said about the bare-walled cabin. Now the room agreed with the description. Josiah came tramping with a sack that clinked. He set it on the new threshold and spilled hardware like a magician reluctantly done with practice hinges. A latch, a handful of nails. That looked like the difference between almost and actual. He carried a plane. He loved the way some men love dogs. Let's see your door, Elias, he said. The plank door was cedar, tongue and groove, heavy enough to stand against weather and argument. Elias had worried the stiles into true and sanded the frame until his shoulders hummed. He and Josiah hung it slow, shimming, planing, checking, reveal, testing swing. When at last it moved with that dignified gravity that makes a door seem like a decision, Josiah stepped back with a pleasure he didn't dress up in false modesty. Now your house knows which way is in, he said. Nora ran her fingers over the latch. Listen, she said. It's the sound of a season closing behind you. Hester arrived with a packet of moss for chinking where the wind had found an alphabet between logs. Miss Evans came with a slate and wrote read across the lintel in chalk, and then laughed at herself and wiped it clean with the heel of her hand. You'll carve it when you aren't borrowing courage from dust, she said, and Jonah took out his knife and scored the date and their name in the soft cedar anyway. Letters deep enough to catch a fingertip on a windless afternoon that smelled of pitch and mushrooms. Joseph walked into the clearing like a man who knew paths even when they weren't there yesterday. Ruth ran to him, then slowed because the valley was teaching her that greetings could be big without being careless. Joseph lifted a hand. He wore a coil of twine over one shoulder and carried a bundle that turned out to be salmon split and hung. The flesh, the color of a new penny. River ran fat, he said. Trade. Nora brought coffee she had sworn never to trade in the snow. Joseph traded back a small pouch of red earth. Paint, he said. Mix with oil. Door likes to be seen in rain. Ruth pleaded with. Her eyes and Nora nodded. The three of them made a paste with bacon grease because olive oil belonged to another coast entirely. Ruth smeared her hands with of red along the outer edge of the door in a line that would be a story later, so we can find it when the world turns grey. She explained to no one in particular. They smoke-dried the salmon on a rack under the eave, where the wind could do half the work and the fire the rest. Joseph showed Jonah a notch that made a quick hanger. He showed Nora how to check the flesh with a press so she could feel when it would keep its virtue in a sack for weeks. He pointed at the far hill. In spring, he said, we dig camas. Come with us. Ground there makes sweet food if you know the trick. He stayed to supper and said nothing during grace because he did not owe the valley the same words they did, but his quiet had a weight that felt like respect. And when they said amen, he nodded, as if the shape of the sound made sense. School under the lightning maple took hold even as the rain made its own curriculum. Miss Evans taught letters in the morning, numbers in the afternoon, and civics whenever a neighbor dispute needed a referee who could divide an acre with a string and a sentence. She did not coddle the boys or doubt the girls. We will need all hands and all minds, she said. We are not rich enough to waste either. Ruth learned her way clean from B to G, and then took 2 maps as if a line drawn elsewhere could make a corner of the valley more itself. She drew their creek and wrote Dare Creek along it, letters extra careful, because the seeds had wanted a name, and the name had wanted an edge. First sickness came for the settlement before it knocked on the Reed's door. A child, 3 claims, overtook fever. Hester went and stayed 2 nights and came back tired with a clean apron and a face that had decided to be stern at whatever came next. Not cholera, she said, and Nora put a hand against the doorframe and let her knees be weak for a moment. Measles, the kind that makes a circle bigger than anyone meant to draw. Keep yours warm and washed. If rash shows, willow and rest and a room that knows how to keep a mother from losing her mind. It spread and then it didn't. The Reeds kept to their work and to the edges of other folks' circles. Temperance Pruitt got spots and then got better, and Hester slept a day in their cabin. Because nobody tells that woman to go home without first offering her a bed, on a Sunday that the rain declared a holiday. The valley gathered for a roof raising at the Wilsons, who had finally collected enough boards and nerve. Men on rafters, women on stew and biscuit, children on cheering. A fiddle came out of a sack like a secret someone had been hoarding since Missouri. The tune didn't so much travel the air as instruct it. Feet found the beat that wagons had taught them months ago, a practical rhythm, push, brace, breathe, repeat. O'Rourke showed up late carrying a box of nails like a penitent. He caught Elias's eye and shrugged. I tried staying put, he said. Turns out I only know one job. I'll put it to a different roof. As winter settled proper, the room that had promised warmth proved it. The hearth learned to pull its share. The oiled paper let in a greyness that still counted as day. The door swung true even when the jam swelled with a week of wet. They used the good plates for Christmas because plates are less for company than for saying, "We mean it." Nora's soaked beans, fried dough in bacon grease, sprinkled sugar with an extravagance she immediately regretted and would do again. Will and Eliza brought apple butter as if apples grew on the backs of kind words. Miss Evans read from Luke with the cadence of a woman who understood stories both human and divine. Joseph stood in the doorway like a leaning post and said good story after the amen, which made half the room smile and the other half decide they liked him even if they didn't understand him. That night the creek spoke low, the door glowed with its line of red, and the cabin breathed. Elias sat bootless on the hearthstones and held those boots in his hands, cracked, stitched, stained, ridiculous as relics. Nora watched him with a look he recognized from the trail, affection, exasperation, and a love that had decided not to. "Keep score, save them," she said. "Tell the story right to anyone who asks, not to scare them, to make them honest." He set the boots by the door, under the red. The rain kept its steady argument with the roof. The ditch did its quiet work. They slept like people who would wake to more work and liked the mouthfeel of that sentence. Asterisk breaking ground. Cornerstones and camas, sweet as honey spring does not. Knock in the Willamette so much as it slips into your sleeves while you're doing something else. One morning the older buds had opinions. The next you could smell green even with your eyes shut. The creek lost its winter voice and began gossiping. Birds practiced again. Mosquitoes reintroduced themselves rudely and without apology. Elias had been sharpening hope all winter. He stood at the edge of ground he meant to pull a crop from and saw not grass but bread. The sod, however, saw no reason to cooperate. It was a web of ferns and roots and stubbornness to decades in the making. Will lent a breaking plough with a share that looked like a wedge carved out of seriousness. "You're not ploughing," he told Elias. "You're turning a hide. Let the point do the insult. Let the team carry the argument through." They yoked the oxen and hitched the plough and set a line with 2 stakes that did not care how romantic Elias felt. The first 20 feet were a demonstration in humility. The plough rode up on the mat, the team pulled, the roots laughed. Will took the handles and set his weight behind the point at a slight angle and said, "Talk nice." Elias discovered a tone he didn't know he had low, patient, more suggestion than command. The blade bit. A strip of earth rolled at last, like a scroll revealing old news. Worms, a shine of moisture. The smell that makes men noble for a full minute. By noon the field had become a series of open sentences. Jonah learned the pace of breaking 2 lengths, rest. 2 more, tighten the chain. Scrape the share with a stick. Admire nothing too long. Ruth picked roots out of the turned rows and stacked them for later, burning with a satisfaction that made her grin inexplicable to anyone who had never touched the middle of a job and felt it touch back. They sowed seed wheat a week later, the way the clerk had said to pronounce it, seed, as if the act were an introduction that should be made politely. Nora walked the row and dropped grain with a rhythm she liked. Ruth followed and covered with her hands, palms dirty and proud. "We are putting commas in the ground," she said. Miss Evans overheard and wrote it in her pocket ledger under the day's date. Children say things worth saving like seeds. Fencing was a negotiation with deer and cows and neighbors. opinions. They split rails and made a zigzag that pleased the eye even before it did a job. Every 20 paces, Jonah drove a pin oak stake like a man who had decided to be taller than his father inside a year. Elias watched him and thought that might be fine. A neighbor quarrel pulled them away from the fence for a day and taught a lesson about maps that had never met the land. The Petersons and a new family, the Brums, discovered their cornerstones had been set by ambition rather than survey. Voices went up. Hats came off in that way that means a line has been drawn. O'Rourke came striding with the long-legged annoyance of a man who had walked too many stupid miles to endure stupid yards. Miss Evans arrived with a chain and a compass that had belonged to a cousin who would have made a fine engineer if he hadn't preferred chasing storms. They measured with care and with witnesses. They blazed bearing trees like the law book instructed. The Brums lost a strip and gained a neighbor who didn't hate them. The Petersons gained a strip and gave back a pie the next Sunday. Miss Evans made them both sign a paper she had written that said, in essence, "We will remember this without reinventing it later." She filed it under the oiled paper in the land office with a glare that dared bureaucracy to misplace anything. Spring brought Joseph back as promised. He led a small procession, his aunt, 2 children carrying baskets. A man old enough that his laugh came with a cough that didn't belong to sickness so much as to having laughed too long. They camped at the base of the slope east of Dare Creek and invited the reeds at dusk. "Camas tomorrow," Joseph said. "Ground is right. We'll show you where to dig without making the field angry." They walked at first light to a meadow that had learned to glow blue in May. Nora stopped at the threshold because the sight looked like a fact you needed permission to repeat. Joseph showed the camas leaf and the false camas leaf and the difference between supper and sorrow. He used a digging stick and a sideways motion that slid under the bulb and caressed it free. Ruth tried and got a root and a mouthful of dirt from where she didn't mind her hands before doing what children do learned with her bones. They pit-roasted the bulbs in a slow fire under stones. Sweetness lived there, under the starch, the way a story sometimes has honey hidden 2 paragraphs in. Joseph's aunt showed Nora how to dry some for later, how to make a paste that could trick a child into thinking candy grew wild. "It does," Ruth declared, and no one corrected her. In return, Nora taught Joseph's aunt the vinegar pie trick. The aunt chewed carefully and nodded, eyes widening at the way tartness could pretend to be another emotion and get away with it. Food mischief takes many forms. By early summer, the garden pushed up with an optimism no one had voted for, but everyone accepted peas, beans, turnip tops that looked like small green flags. Jonah nailed a shelf under the EV and set the Dutch oven where rain could smell it but not spoil it. He built a bake oven from clay and stone at the edge of the yard, a low beehive of heat that wanted to be courted and then rewarded. The first bread from their own hands course, proud, impatient with the knife, came out of that oven. On a Tuesday afternoon, the sky had decided to be loud with swallows. Nora cut it, steam lifting like a benediction. She handed heel to Elias, sliced to Jonah, heel to Ruth, then took a piece for herself and closed her eyes before biting. Because reverence looks like dramaturgy, but isn't. Not everything joined the choir. Cutworms took a row of cabbage in a night. Slugs made lace of the lettuce. A late frost breathed mean on the bean vines and left half of them asking for a second chance and getting it. Deer hopped the fence with the entitlement of nobility until Jonah and Elias hung tin clackers and a pair of old shirts stuffed with grass and impatience. The deer were not fooled exactly, but they were bored, and boredom is a tool too. Jonah spent Fridays at Josiah's forge when the ground didn't demand a body. He learned the difference between a heat you can use and a heat that will punish you for trying. Between a hammer that finds the face it means to, and a hammer that talks nonsense with your wrist. He came home with a draw knife he had finished, and a hinge with a flourish at the end he pretended he had not meant. That's vanity, Elias said, grinning. Keep it. Miss Evans's school moved from under the maple to the Shores barn on wet days, because spelling and rainwater made poor arithmetic together. She taught geography with a map that still had the ocean-colored wrong and the mountains drawn as. If they hesitated, she pinned a sheet of paper to the barn wall and asked each child to write one word that felt like this year so far. Ruth wrote ENOUGH. Jonah, dragged into the exercise, wrote work and underlined it twice. A boy from the far edge of the valley wrote blue after the camas, and Miss Evans put a hand briefly to her chest because children say the thesis in one syllable, while adults use 20 and still circle the runway. Midsummer brought a fire, up valley, a stand of order that had been dead too long, really, but the smoke gathered everyone all the same. Buckets, blankets, wet sacks, a line of people older than their faces and younger than their hands. They knocked it down before it thought to be a story for the newspapers back home. Afterwards, the Shores passed a jug that made the rounds, and Hester washed a man's eyebrow where the heat had curled it, and O'Rourke looked at Elias and said, "Every trail looks easier in hindsight." Elias nodded. "So does every winter." There was talk of a meeting house and a schoolhouse. There was talk of a sawmill where the creek dropped its voice enough to motive a wheel. There were 2 babies delivered by Hester, with Miss Evans measuring water and Will hammering a shelf in someone else's kitchen, because men who can't do anything useful during a birth need something that pretends to be. There was a Sunday when Ruth read a passage in meeting without missing a word, and Nora's face managed not to break with pride until they were among friends outside, as the wheat ambered. The valley made a sound like waiting the soft hiss of wind through heads not yet cut. Elias walked the lines in the evening with his hands behind his back, the way his father had done in a field that smelled like Illinois and ease. He looked at the sky and the edge of the hills, took the measure of what the meadowlarks said about weather, and went to sleep making lists he would forget and then remember and then forget again. One night he and Nora sat on the step under the red of the door while the light went to bed slow. "Do you miss the moving?" she asked. He thought before he answered. "I miss the company," he said, "and sometimes the feeling that every mile made us better, but I don't miss not belonging." He tapped the door jamb with 2 fingers. "I like saying ours and not feeling like I've stolen the word." Nora leaned her head against his shoulder. The creek agreed. The field listened. The sky didn't care, and that felt right. In the distance, a coyote took attendance, and the deer declined to answer. The cutting would come soon. Work would tilt from persuasion to harvest. The valley had a way of saying, now, and meaning it. The reeds nodded back. Asterisk harvest, a dance under the maple. And what the boots remembered, they cut with a cradle scythe, because that's what broke men into a steady song. Morning when the dew still held the straw's dust, evening when the heat stepped back and let her back breathe. Jonah learned the swing hips, shoulders, arms, a curve the blade understood if pride stayed out of it. Elias bundled behind him, twisting the straw into bands that bit knuckles. Ruth stooped, proud of making tidy teepees that would shed a surprise rain should the sky forget its manners. O'Rourke brought a borrowed fanning mill that had already had 3 owners and 1 argument. They winnowed above the beehive oven where a clean wind funneled down the yard. Chaff made a golden storm that stuck to sweat and lashes and made Ruth sneeze with delight. The sound of grain pouring, at last, into a sack, a sound like rain you could keep, ran up the lane and made neighbors smile without needing to ask why. They threshed with flails, with boot heels, with a plank dragged in circles by a horse that had opinions but consented with oats. It took days and blisters and the kind of patience that had been sharpened by Nevada sand and Blue Mountain snow before it was applied to straw. When they weighed the sacks on a scale that had come west in a clerk's trunk and chosen a more honest life, the number said enough for bread through winter, with room to be generous. Nora pressed her forehead to the nearest sack and smiled a smile. The valley could have used to teach weather moderation. The first loaf, baked of their own wheat, came out of the oven darker than the flour that came on ships and was more eloquent. They ate it with salmon Joseph had brought in trade for a broken stirrup he swore he didn't need until it was fixed. They ate it with butter that Eliza had churned from the cow that had learnt to like Will's music. They ate it with gratitude, and a caution not to use that word so often it got dull. A storm tore a strip of roof from the Wilsons' barn the next week. Men went up with ropes and a stubbornness that bordered on theology. The barn held. The storm tried a second time and then went to blame the coastal hills. After, the valley gathered under the lightning maple and danced, because that's what people do after choosing work over fear. The fiddle had found a friend in a man who claimed he didn't know how to play and proved himself a liar. O'Rourke endured a set with Hester to prove he was still alive. His grin was what made the children squeal. Miss Evans danced once and then fed the small ones who had danced too hard to remember supper. Joseph watched from just outside the circle, amused and tolerant, until Ruth dragged him in by the hand. He moved like a man who knew how to place his feet in new rooms. The Brums brought cider. The Pruitts brought the baby who was not a baby anymore and who clapped at the right times like she'd practiced. Will Shaw brought a joke that half the valley had heard and still laughed at, because kindness is sometimes allowing a punchline room to breathe. There was one fire that didn't learn. Obedience on the ridge above the settlement where a dry patch had stored wind for a month. It ran hard one afternoon. The valley ran harder. Lines formed, buckets passed, orders made with words that had stopped being pretty. They saved the schoolhouse barn, really, with a wall full of letters, and the meeting house with a roof that had wanted to burn to see what the fuss was about. Eliza's hands blistered. Josiah scorched his eyebrows and refused to stop flirting with his wife about it. A boy from the far claim, Alec of the Blue, carried water until he dropped, woke in Miss Evans's lap, and grinned as if he'd been paid. After the valley looked at itself with relief and exhaustion and a sense of something like pride that didn't need to parade. Hester stitched a burn and scolded a man who deserved it. Nora poured coffee from an iron pot that would have humbled a legend. Elias watched Jonah at the edge of exhausted men and saw him talk to O'Rourke about ridgepoles, and saw in that picture a line drawn past his own year's work continuing. Shoulders carrying, decisions migrating to a younger back without protest. Summer tilted. The garden gave its last large opinions and then grew quiet. The orchard that wasn't yet an orchard, 6 sticks of apple and pear and 1 plum with a mulish street took root. Ruth named them in a list in her slate. Pippin, red, summer, Bartlett, winter, plum, and underlined them the way you would underline siblings. If you meant to keep track of their birthdays, there were troubles. A letter from back east took a season to arrive and brought a grief that had happened half a year before. A cow miscarried, and Eli has discovered that men cry in barns because the acoustics are kind. The law arrived in the form of a circuit rider who wanted a fee the land office had forgotten to collect. They paid in grain, in nails, in goodwill banked the winter prior. The rider rode on less certain of his job and more certain of the people, who now owned this valley by labor rather than decree. There were domestic victories so small they looked like nothing unless you had been hungry for them. A shelf that held, a gourd that kept, a broom that swept and didn't smear, a patch on Jonah's knee he hadn't been able to put there himself when they were hauling in the last of the pea vines. There was a morning when the sun came through the oiled paper so golden that Ruth announced the window was learning to be glass, and everybody laughed and nobody corrected her. The first frost drew fern script on the cedar railings. The wheat sacks sat like squat men in a row and looked pleased with themselves. Elias set aside a bushel in a barrel marked seed and told Ruth not to steal from it, even for play. But they like being dared, she said about seeds and Joseph's words and her own. They do, he said. We will dare them in March, not December. On a Sunday, the valley listened to a visiting preacher who had not done the trail and still managed not to offend anyone. He said, "Count your mercies," and Nora did, quietly, on her fingers, Jonah standing straighter. Ruth's slate full of maps, Eliza's cough that had not come back since the rain made a truce with their roof, Dare Creek inside its ditch, a door with a red line that said home to anyone looking from the road. A friend named Joseph who showed them where sweetness grew underground, and a midwife named Hester who made scolding into a sacrament in late autumn. A letter went east with Will's cousin, who was taking a raft down river to sell boards and buy blankets. Nora wrote most of it, her hand steady on the page. She told about miles that had stopped being numbers and started being chores. She told about a girl named Ruth who had made a new river have a name. She told about a boy who had learned to swing a scythe without hating it, and a man who had learned that doors matter like birthdays. She did not tell about graves along the Platte by number. She wrote, "We remember," and that was enough truth for a page that had to fold and fit a pocket. They held a harvest supper under the maple with a cloth that pretended to be long enough when it wasn't. Vinegar pie, summer's dried apples, salmon that had lost nothing by waiting, brined beans that tasted like patience. The fiddle came out. O'Rourke said the blessing in a voice that had mostly been used for orders and found itself surprisingly able to whisper thanks. Miss Evans sang a song from a school with windows and decided she liked this sky better. As the night chilled, Elias fetched the boots from their place by the door. He set them beside the fire like two old men at the end of a table. Ruth touched one with a fingertip and looked up at him. "Will you tell it again?" she asked, and he nodded, and he told the story the way he had learned to tell it, without the romance he'd been offered back east and without the bitterness. The trail could have sold him wholesale. He told about cholera and the sound canvas makes when hail wants to be cruel. He told about a boy pulled from a stream and a man not pulled from a wagon. He told about coffee spilled into snow to save a hand and a ferry rope that thrummed like a song you refuse to forget. He told about a meadow where snow made a room, and a baby named Temperance who turned crying into a treaty with fear. He told about a road that looked shorter on a map than it did underfoot, and about a valley that didn't settle for being a rumor. He finished the way he always finished. Not with a moral, but with a ledger. We owed, we paid, we were paid. He looked at Nora and at the line of red on the door. He looked at Jonah, who had the forged smell on him even after soap, and at Ruth, who had the map smell on her even after stew. He looked at the neighbors, these people who had learned the same whether he had learned and kept its company anyway, later. When the valley slept, the ditch shone with a thread of moon. The creek whispered the same word it had been saying since they'd arrived. Stay. The door, shut against a light frost, knew which way was in and which was out. The boots kept their counsel. If you lay down then any were, but perhaps in this small cabin on Dare Creek you would have heard what Elias did. The slow exhale of a room that means to hold, the tiny tick of cooling cedar, the three breaths. Rhythm of a family whose days would not be easy and did not need to be to feel full. And if you were far away in a bed softer than a wagon board, you might hear it anyway through the telling. A measured heartbeat, westward and home. The end, asterisk.